Welcome to a new unit on imperialism. Imperialism is kind of the United States' entry into kind of the modern world. Imperialism means for a country to control another country. So it's kind of like manifest destiny that we've already spent time talking about, only now we're going abroad and overseas. In the imperialism unit, we'll cover many things that I think are really important as far as understanding the United States kind of status in the world. But a couple of things that will happen in this unit are that William McKinley, who was the president kind of purchased by Carnegie and Rockefeller and JP Morgan, will be replaced by Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt's really an interesting guy. He really intelligent, but lacked some social emotional kind of skills. He spoke 9 languages, read almost a book a day, it was said, and would often read a book in its native tongue as opposed to reading the translation, which he considered kind of like, watching the movie instead of reading the book sort of thing. During this time period, we fought the Spanish-American War. It was the first major conflict since the Civil War, and it really acted to bring the nation together. We also buy the rights to construct the Panama Canal, which changes the course of economic and trade history. We build something called the Great White Fleet and become one of the military powers of the world when we do that. And so away we go. Let's explore. So when we left off kind of territorially, we were working on manifest destiny, right? The different things that the United States did to gain its territory that reached all the way to the West Coast. And we have talked about these different events in history that allowed for us to gain that territory. But once that territory had been gained, we started to look overseas for additional territories. And that's where our story begins. In 1893, Queen Liliuokalani realized that her reign in Hawaii had come to an end. More than 160 U.S. sailors and Marines stood ready to aid the Haoles, which is a word for white foreigners, who planned to overthrow the Hawaiian monarchy. In an eloquent statement of protest, the proud monarch surrendered to the superior forces of the United States. This is what she said. I, Liliuokalani, do hereby solemnly protest against any and all acts done against myself and the constitutional government of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Now, to avoid any collision of armed forces and perhaps loss of life, I do under this protest yield my authority until such time as the government of the United States shall undo the action of its representatives and reinstate me in the authority which I claim as the constitutional sovereign of the Hawaiian Islands. So in effect, what she's saying is that I am going to surrender because I care more about my people and their livelihood than I do about maintaining power, but that the United States is doing the wrong thing. The U.S. ambassador to Hawaii, his name was John Stevens. He informed the State Department, the Hawaiian pear is now fully ripe, and this is the golden hour for the United States to pluck it. The annexation of Hawaii was only one of the goals of the American empire builders in the late 19th century. So today's goal is for you to understand the causes of imperialism. Just plant the seed in your head that there are 4 ideas, and at the end of the day, we need to ask ourselves if you know what they are. Some key people in this first section is Alfred T. Mahan, and Alaska and Hawaii and William Seward will be covered in the next lesson. So Americans has always sought to expand the size of their nation, and throughout the 19th century, they extended their control toward the Pacific Ocean. However, by the 1880s, many American leaders had become convinced that the United States needed to join other imperialist powers of Europe and establish colonies overseas. Imperialism the policy in which stronger nations extend their economic, political, and military control over weaker nations was already a trend around the world. European nations had been establishing colonies, in some cases, for hundreds of years. In the late 19th century, Africa had emerged as a prime target of European expansionism. By the early 20th century, there were only 2 independent countries in all of Africa. Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent. Every other country in Africa, and at one point there were 53 nations in Africa, had all been seized and controlled by foreign powers. Imperialists also competed for territory in Asia, especially in China. In its late 19th century reform era, Japan replaced its old feudal order with a strong central government. Hoping that military strength would bolster industrialization, Japan joined European nations in competition for China in the 1890s. Most Americans gradually kind of warmed up to the idea of expansion overseas. With a belief in manifest destiny, they already had pushed the US border to the Pacific Ocean. And there were other factors that fueled this kind of new American imperialism. So, if we're thinking about 4 causes, one of them is right in front of you. There was global competition going on. The United States felt that if they didn't get involved in this kind of competition for colonies, that they would be left out. And in the worst case scenario, they became one of the targets. And so it was kind of play the game or be played. At least that's what some people thought during the time period. The second cause of imperialism was a desire for military strength. So this guy over here, this is Alfred Thayer Mahan. He joined the US Navy in the late 1850s, and he served for nearly 40 years. In 1886, he became the president of a newly established Naval War College, which was located in Newport, Rhode Island. Throughout his lifetime, he was one of the most outspoken advocates of American military expansionism. He wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power on U.S. History. It was published in 1890, and he called for the United States to develop a modern fleet capable of protecting American business and shipping interests around the world. And that led to the creation of this down here, the Great White Fleet. I believe they were 9 steel-hulled cruisers that after they were constructed, they were kind of taken on tour around the world to kind of show off the military strength of the United States. The hulls of the ships were painted white, and that's why it was called the Great White Fleet. Anyway, Alfred Mahan advocated and urged the United States to build up its navy. At this point in history, in the late 1800s, the strength of a country's military was really in large part determined by the strength of their navy. And so this is where he says we should spend the most money. It just so happens that Teddy Roosevelt, who we talked about on the first screen, who was Assistant Secretary to the Navy before he became president, and as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and an avid reader, he read Mahan's book, and he decided to push for the application of Mahan's ideas, and this led to the Great White Fleet being constructed in the first place. But there's more to it than that, because Mahan urged the government officials not only to build up naval power, but to do other things as well, because it's one thing to have the ships, but you need other things as well in order to really have them operate around the world. So here are some of the things that he urges the United States to do. Build up their navy, yes, but then you also need strategic ports located around the world. You also need fueling stations around the world. He also advocated for a canal zone that would allow for one of our coasts for our ships to get from one coast to the other in a quicker, more efficient way. At this point, people are traveling all the way around the tip of South America. That took significant amounts of time. And so he was arguing for a canal zone to be completed. There were multiple routes being considered. There was a route through Nicaragua, and there was an old French kind of construction site in Colombia. And we chose the one in Colombia to kind of buy up the bankrupt French project and build a canal zone. Okay. The strategic ports and the fueling stations, though, meant that we needed to acquire islands, and we went about doing that as a result of Roosevelt pushing for the application of Alfred Mahan's book and the ideas in it. So let's take a look at a couple. So these are some of the reasons that over the course of the next few years, we gained control over a number of islands in the Pacific Ocean. So they were considered strategically located ports and fueling stations. And in order for our Navy to be its most efficient, we needed to have these like kind of stopovers. We also needed strategically located ports to get supplies into this canal zone area. And so this is why the acquisition of many of these Caribbean islands during the time period, so that we could have kind of a home base for the construction that was going to take place in here. Now, a quick thing to note is that Panama, as a country, didn't exist at this point. This is all part of Colombia, and we'll get to that story later on. Panama will exist by the time this is all said and done, and you'll see why. Okay, so like I said, at one point, Africa was made up of 53 nations. All but two were controlled by foreign powers. Liberia and Ethiopia, the only two independent nations in all of Africa, due to the kind of scramble. And this is a representative of the Qin dynasty. And here you can see England represented, Germany represented, Russia represented, and Japan represented as people that are countries that are looking to kind of divide up parts of China. This is, by the way, a cartoon from 1898. It wouldn't be appropriate today due to the skin tone shifts and the animalistic-like features of the Qin dynasty representative. The elongated fingernails, the elongated facial hair that looks like whiskers, all that purposeful. Okay, so far we've talked about global competition and a desire to kind of show off military strength. The third reason for imperialism had to do with, it ties really nicely with industrialization. So in the process of industrializing, our nation increased the output of goods substantially. Now, the problem was that we quickly saturated our own American consumer markets for those goods and then really needed to seek out other markets for selling those products. So in order to maintain economic power and our industrial strength, we needed to find other people to buy our products. In addition, in order to fuel the Industrial Revolution, we needed to make sure we had access to raw materials that would continue to fuel it. And in some cases, we had large supplies in the United States. In some cases, we knew that over time, those were finite supplies and we would need to access materials in other places. So the colonies were supposed to provide, it means the same idea as the British colonizing what would become the United States, right? We were to provide raw materials and also buy finished goods. Now the United States is in that same situation, looking for colonies to provide their raw materials and to sell finished goods back to. So by the end of this imperialist time period, by the time we're talking like 1910 and the beginnings of World War I, which happens around 1914, The United States is now exporting more than it's importing. And so the thirst for new markets has been acquired. And we are selling more than we're bringing in, which led to economic and industrial strength in the United States. Officially, this is what your textbook says about this category. In the late 19th century, advances in technology enabled American farms and factories to produce far more than American citizens could consume. Now the U.S. needed raw materials for its factories and new markets for its agricultural and manufactured goods. Imperialists viewed foreign trade as the solution to many American problems like overproduction and unemployment and economic depression. Finally and lastly, and probably the most difficult to describe fully because it's a complex idea, is the idea of a belief in cultural superiority. So we talked a little bit about Anglo-Saxon superiority and Herbert Spencer and social Darwinism and those ideas in the last unit. But cultural factors were also used to kind of justify imperialism. In many ways, the United States viewed itself as having a responsibility to kind of Christianize and bring to light many of the places that were still like in development, any countries and peoples that were in development. Some Americans combined the philosophy of social Darwinism, which was, remember, a belief that free market competition would lead to survival of the fittest, with a belief in the racial superiority of Anglo-Saxons. They argued that the United States had a responsibility to spread Christianity and to civilize the world's inferior people. This viewpoint today, of course, is criticized for narrowly defining what it is to be civilized. And we were also, it was according to the standards of our culture that we were putting this definition upon others. But it did justify, or it sought to justify, the actions that the United States was taking. So, for example, there's a time in the Spanish-American War where the president of the United States is just kind of, he's up at night and he's walking and pacing, trying to decide if we should take the Philippine Islands or not. And after walking around all night, it comes to him and he says, you know what? It's just our duty to bring Christianity to the Philippine Islands. And so, yes, indeed, we should go to war and take the Philippine Islands from Spain. Well, again, he's narrowly defining what it is to be civilized because the Philippine Islands had already been introduced to Christianity long before that. So he's just using that as an opportunity to kind of justify his actions. And he's an example of this kind of cultural superiority, this kind of complex that we have that, of course, somebody would be thankful and grateful for our expertise in an area. Okay, so one more time, global competition, a thirst for new markets, a belief in cultural superiority, and a desire for kind of flexing our newfound military strength are all reasons that the United States enters into this time period called imperialism. Some really early examples of imperialism, in fact, some acquisitions that occurred prior to this time period. One is the acquisition of Alaska. An early supporter of American expansionism was a guy named William Seward, who happened to be the Secretary of State underneath Abraham Lincoln. So we're talking 1860s, right? He, in 1867, arranged for the United States to buy Alaska from the Russians for $7.2 million. Seward had some significant trouble persuading the House of Representatives to approve funding for the purchase. Some people made a lot of fun of him, calling it Seward's icebox or Seward's folly. Time showed, though, that they were really wrong. In 1959, Alaska officially became a state, and for about 2 cents an acre, the United States had acquired a land rich in timber and mineral, and as it would eventually turn out, oil as well. So on the test, it will ask you about the earliest acquisition, and a lot of people miss that question. The earliest acquisition was Alaska, well ahead of the time period. The second acquisition that we're going to spend some time talking about is Hawaii. So just a quick FYI, one of the reasons, there's a longer story about the history of annexing Hawaii for sure, but one of the reasons that Hawaii was strategically important was just due to geographic location, but it was also a place where sugar could grow, sugarcane. And during the late 1800s, sugar, white refined sugar, was a very valuable product. Today, just so you know, this is the way that sugar cane and white refined sugar used to be made primarily. But now, at least in the United States, most of our sugar comes from a sugar beet. Okay, but there are still places where sugar cane is the kind of raw product to create the white refined sugar. Molasses is the byproduct of the white refined sugar. And there was a time, I think you guys will remember from your world history class, that kings and queens thought that by brushing your teeth with raw sugar, just because of the granular nature, that it would whiten and clean their teeth, which of course is why Queen Elizabeth had a mouthful of rotten teeth and really bad breath. Okay, last piece. In 1867, the same year in which Alaska was purchased, the United States took over the Midway Islands, which lie in the middle of the Pacific about 1,300 miles north of Hawaii. No one lived on the islands, so it didn't really attract much attention. But Hawaii was another question. The Hawaiian Islands had been economically important to the United States for nearly 100 years. Since the 1790s, American merchants had stopped there on their way to China and to India. In the 1820s, Yankee missionaries had founded Christian schools and churches on the islands. Their children and grandchildren became sugar planters who sold most of their crop to the United States. In the mid-19th century, American-owned sugar plantations accounted for about 3/4 of the Hawaiian Islands' wealth. Plantation owners imported thousands of laborers from Japan and Portugal and China. By 1900, foreigners and immigrant laborers outnumbered native Hawaiians by 3-1. White planters, sugarcane planters, profited from close ties with the United States. In 1875, the United States agreed to import Hawaiian sugar completely duty-free. And over the next 15 years, Hawaiian sugar production increased 9 times over. But then, William McKinley came into office. And if you remember, McKinley was the president that Carnegie and Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan wanted. And remember, they wanted a lack of regulation, and they wanted their industries protected. And so one of the things that McKinley did in office was to pass a really high tariff. So now the sugar coming from Hawaii was going to be taxed by the McKinley tariff. So the McKinley tariff of 1890 provoked an absolute crisis amongst the Hawaiian sugarcane plantation owners by eliminating the kind of duty-free status of their Hawaiian sugar. As a result, the Hawaiian sugar growers faced competition in the American market. American planters in Hawaii called for the United States to just annex the islands so they wouldn't have to pay that duty. U.S. military and economic leaders already understood the value of the islands. In 1887, they pressured Hawaii to allow the United States to build a naval base there at Pearl Harbor, the kingdom's very best port. The base became a refueling station for American ships. So at the end of the day, it was just kind of too convenient. It was a refueling station. It was going to allow the sugar to come in duty-free. And so the United States chooses to annex Hawaii. This continues to be a problem for Hawaiians today, that continue to be outnumbered by others on their islands. This is King Kalakaua. And at the point that we are in the story, Hawaii is being led by this king. He is being strong-armed, though, by white business leaders. They force him to amend Hawaii's constitution, effectively limiting the voting rights to only wealthy landowners. When King Kalakaua died in 1891, his sister, Queen Liliuokalani, took over, and she tried to kind of create Hawaii for Hawaiians. She proposed removing the property owning qualifications for voting. To prevent this from happening, though, business groups organized themselves together, and they set up an overthrow of the government, and they put this guy in power. This is Sanford B. Dole. You see his name on Dole Pineapple. Sanford B. Dole became the new kind of president, and he became, when they overthrew the queen, the new president of Hawaii. So Queen Liliuokalani is no more. And just on a side note, Queen Liliuokalani is responsible for writing Aloha Oe, which is the song that most people associate with Hawaii. She wrote the lyrics in that song. President Cleveland directed that the queen be restored to her throne. When Dole refused to surrender power, Cleveland formally recognized the Republic of Hawaii, but he refused to consider annexation unless a majority of Hawaiians favored it. But in 1897, when William McKinley took over, he favored annexation, and he was the person who had succeeded Grover Cleveland. So on August 12th of 1898, Congress proclaimed Hawaii an American territory, and although Hawaiians have never had the chance to vote, in 1959, Hawaii became the 50th state of the United States. Okay, that is how we start. So Alaska and Hawaii as our first examples of American imperialism. And then to end the day, I just wanted you to take a look at this political cartoon. This is by a political cartoonist during the time period. I'm wondering if you can look at it, analyze carefully, and then ask yourself, is the cartoonist an imperialist or an anti-imperialist? And the next time we get together, we will dissect this political cartoon. Thank you.